In this episode of On Point with Karim, I sat down with Lynn Schneider. She's an analyst with the market research firm IDC. Part of Lynn's time is dedicated to the location intelligence market, and she speaks regularly with technology vendors. We spoke about the rise of data marketplaces and how this is impacting business intelligence solutions as well as its users. I think you'll find this an extremely informative discussion with someone who takes both an analytical as well as an agnostic approach to looking at the location intelligence market. Stay tuned for another episode of On Point. So Lynn, yeah, thanks very much for doing this. We've got a lot of ground to cover with some of these. So let's just start off with maybe some of what your clients are seeing and how they're using location technology and whether they find it a more critical part of their analytical process.
Yeah, so what I would say is that what's happened is that who the clients are have really expanded. So it's not just traditional GIS departments who are interested in things related to location, but I think there's been a slow and steady drumbeat where people who are maybe your more traditional business analysts or, you know, I hesitate to say more traditional data scientists, but folks have really been expanding their horizons to look at what location as context can add to what they've been doing in terms of forecasting, customers, all sorts of different kinds of use cases.
Do you think that's as a result of maybe the increased awareness of location technology? We see it every day in the apps we have on our mobile phones, or is there something other more intrinsic that they see that they didn't have before?
Yeah, so I think it's something that, if we were to spin back the clock a full 2 years ago, if we put ourselves in the fall of 2019, that it was gaining some traction, right? Because people were becoming bigger users of B2C applications that included some aspect of location, whether that was, Apple Maps, Google Maps, find restaurants near me, whatever it was. But that the period of the pandemic when people and businesses were trying to view things kind of within their box, where they were sheltering in place or where, they were working from home or they were working from some alternative location. I think that just made it even more salient in people's minds that location is an important aspect of how things happen, that people could use location intelligence and location related data to observe places where they were not physically.
Yeah.
So, not just transactions, but, tracking the pollution in China to figure out if the factories were back up and running again, things like that.
Well, and there was also, a great deal of emphasis put on just general traffic analysis because we saw cars leaving the road. You
Mhm.
could actually see that there was a diminished amount of cars that led to a diminished amount of pollution. And I think people recognized by seeing whatever media that they were watching, whether it was the New York Times or whatever, that was exposing some of these things and exposing them visually as maps, that all of a sudden people went, oh, wow, I didn't realize the spatial extent of what was happening.
Well, I think also there were limitations and rules that varied by geography. And it wasn't even, say big geography, like what's the rule in the US versus what's the rule in Canada, but what's the rule in the county where I live versus, the county where I want to go get groceries or, go to the doctor or what have you, because so many decisions were made at a very tight geographic level.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that people looked at, I know I certainly did, was, the John Hopkins website that was stood up to look at everything. And I think people understood the power of visualization, but also because it was a dashboard, they could interact with the data in particular, that got a lot of people thinking about how I can now visualize and analyze the data. I don't know if you saw that or whether you think that was a factor, but it was viewed so many times that I wonder that if you had, all of these business intelligence users that are now coming into looking at a different way of analysis, whether it's a Tableau user or whoever, that they too found that, oh, well, maybe I ought to try this in my BI tool.
Well, I think the point that you made, Joe, about the interactivity, I hadn't even thought of it before you said that, but now when I see demos and I hear people talk through use cases, from vendors or even people showing their own best practices, one of the things that they really highlight is that interactivity. That it's not just coming back and saying, well, to get to our store, people travel on average 3.5 miles, but to be able to click into that map and say, where are our customers coming from?
Yeah.
How long do they take to get there?
So that brings up an interesting question, which is, now that people can interact, is that exposing maybe either a lack of expertise that they didn't formerly know they lacked about having to analyze location data, and now all of a sudden they go, oh, I really want to analyze this deeper, and it isn't just a pretty picture anymore, it's the analytics and the interactivity behind it.
Well, I think it just goes back to in the abstract. I think folks hadn't necessarily realized the important context that location plays.
Okay, well,
But
that's
when they could physically see those things in front of them, it just brought it back to mind. And maybe I say that because I'm kind of a visual person.
well, and let's explore that a little deeper, because that's the most obvious part of location analytics is the map. But there are some who want to go deeper into the analytics that say that it isn't all about the map. It's that deeper analytics that utilizes the technology kind of under the hood, that exposes the information in a way that doesn't have to be visual, but really gets at some of the meat of true location analytics.
Yeah, and I would say that you are right that, just because I like to have things a little bit concrete, to pick on a use case, like, you're trying to figure out who's shopping in a particular store and what their commute time is and all of those things. That, yeah, you could see a map that had a lot of car paths on it, but that's not really analytics.
Right, right.
But, if instead, what you see is kind of physically where that store is on the map. Then you see a chart to the side that shows kind of deciles of commute time. And then you can click into those and learn more about the demographics or, the affinity card use of the shoppers who are making that kind of trip to your store. I think that is the deeper analytics that you're talking about, but putting it in the context of location and adding that interactivity, which I think that you had, in a Tableau, a Click, a Power BI, but that it, I don't know, it brings a new user friendliness and visualization to it. It adds really that additional dimension.
If we went to the other side of that, so back up from visualization all the way to the data quality side, the data integration side, do you find that clients now realize that that's a very critical part of the entire process, and that, it isn't quite, black and white, that, oh, I've bought this data, now I can just look at it. I've now got to consider all of the implications of quality, the authoritative sources of the data, et cetera.
I think that there is a huge gulf or stopping point between a business analyst or manager or an executive looking at the interactivity or the possibilities and the roadmap that's necessary to make that a reality for their
Yeah,
company. I think that, you know, most data scientists and data engineers are wise enough in a certain way that they've kind of stepped away from location and spatial related analytics and have said, you know what, that's a specialty area. I can get to some of that sort of, but they kind of need the push from the end users to get them over that hump of it is more difficult.
And that brings up the question of whether geospatial data is a special data type, or is it just another piece of data? Is there really any more expertise that you need to analyze location-based information than you would a spreadsheet of financial information?
Well, I would say that it's like adding any other dimension. Like as you're saying that, what's coming into my mind is, we didn't always do time series analysis,
Mm.
right? And in a way, time is a special attribute, right? Because, we count it, we got funny formats for it. Not everybody uses the same format, so you have to check the file, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
But now, could you find somebody who's a data scientist or a business analyst really of any worth who doesn't know there is some stickiness, but I need to have time?
Yeah, yeah. Let me ask you about a report that IDC published on data marketplaces. And I know the one that I'm referring to, and you're probably familiar, is the one sponsored by HERE, which is a partner of ours. But I'm wondering if you see data marketplaces like HERE or data as a service rising, because you only see the traditional player like a HERE, but you see Snowflake and Amazon standing up data marketplaces. And I wonder if that adds to whether the education of users or the confusion of users that they're now seeing geodata in these marketplaces.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that geodata is probably most often found in a specialized platform, like Here's location platform, like things that are available through Esri's Living Atlas, or even some of the other kind of more traditional GIS and spatial informatics. You go to a Carto, they have data sets as well that, if you go to an Amazon Data Exchange, to a Snowflake, to some of the others, there are some location related attributes, and even you've got AWS with the new location service, right? So
Right.
It's definitely top of mind for a lot of people. I think that the marketplaces are providing exposure to more of the art of what's possible, but I do think that really for the bulk of users, but certainly the newer users, somebody like Here or even an Esri is doing some, I hesitate to call it quality control and standardization, but they're making the data sets more ready to analyze.
And so by saying that, you think that they can ingest the data into these platforms more readily and have some faith that, again, this is an authoritative source and it's good data and I'm going to be able to use it immediately.
Right. And also, when you can correlate it to points of interest or areas of interest, that it really happened in those places.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's
Okay.
been, standardized in a certain way.
Yeah, I struggle with the data marketplaces because there would be an assumption, and I go back to my earlier statement that I'm a BI user and I automatically know how to process the data. And I remember going to a Tableau user conference, and they make these wonderfully visual dashboards, and they're the vizzes, that as they call them. And yet I hope that people understand that they are more than just pretty pictures and that there's meaning behind them and that there's true analytical capability in these platforms. And so the question arises, am I a Tableau user or am I an Esri user? And what's the level of analytics that I can do with these platforms? And where's this Venn diagram of the overlap of the two? Like, oh, well, Tableau is really just a GIS platform and I can use that. Do you see any confusion in that space?
Well, I would say that there's even a third space, which is the creation of apps or dashboards where it really is more kind of a pick list, right? And
Uh-huh.
people aren't truly setting up their own analytics. They've essentially set up a dashboard for review,
Okay.
that more the business operator can use. I think that it depends how sophisticated and precise. Like, do you need the full capabilities of a GIS in order to do the kind of analysis that you're doing? Like, would I want to take data derived from spatial imagery to figure out, deforestation and put that into Tableau? Well, of course not.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not built for that purpose. Now, if I was trying to do something about the um, demographics of my shoppers from various different zip codes, I could display that on a map in Tableau. I could put that into more of a GIS visualization. And I think then you're talking about what is the organization more familiar with, or what do they want to be combining that data with?
Well, that's a good point. But if I look at some of those satellite companies today that are capturing remotely sensed data, and they're trying to turn that data into forested cover, and getting all the, even just tree species data. I think what I'm seeing is that they finally recognize that they're a data company and not a satellite company. And right, so that what they want to do is have these derivative data sets provided to more users, not just the traditional GIS user. So there would be nothing to say that they couldn't sell you a map of deforestation and import that into Tableau. And I think that that's what may be pushing even the Tableaus of the world to creating more functionality in their platform.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly I don't know that you can point to a general BI tool that doesn't have some mapping and locational representation visualization today.
Yeah.
And that probably wasn't true 3 years ago.
Well, and it certainly wasn't true 10 or 15 years ago when I tried to talk to a BI company and going, oh, well, that's just map stuff. We don't really need that. And as you say, every BI tool today has some sort of map visualization. So that's a great progression of our industry, I guess, to the point where we've educated a broader level of users, maybe. I don't know.
And I think that education, yeah, and not like deep technical education, like, do you need to go to a university and take a GIS course? But kind of the socialization and understanding of the possibilities is where you see the two different kinds of companies at a crossroads today.
Right, right.
Right? Because you see companies who've been more associated with the term GIS or with those specialists. And even as you mentioned about the satellite companies or some of the, derivative analytics, Descartes Lab and Orbital Insights, somebody like that, they can't grow just appealing to the audience who's always bought those products.
I think
And
that's
at
an
the same
excellent point.
time, a Tableau or a Click or someone like that is saying, well, I've got this really great entrenched user base. Why don't I just grow incrementally in functionality?
Right. Does that put any additional pressure on people like chief data officers, CIOs, to wrestle with a new type of data, and not just the type of data, but the volume of data that they're ingesting? I mean, do you get any questions like that from CIOs or CDOs?
Yeah, I mean, the volume question is a big thing. I think that the other development here that enables the greater utilization of location and geospatial intelligence and analytics is the ability to have some of that data and processing in the cloud. that people just couldn't deal with the space constraints. They couldn't deal with the need for compute if this wasn't cloud based.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you see the companies that are very cloud native, the Databricks, the Snowflakes, being able to now manage geospatial primitive data, points, lines, and areas. And that's a new development in and of itself, that now these companies know that they have to be able to process and analyze geospatial data.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's funny. I've been chatting with my colleague who helps monitor the overall data sphere, right? And in addition to video and everything, so many new startup satellite companies. And where is all that data going?
And that's one of the questions that I raised just a while ago, which is there's so much data being collected, and they're going to have to turn that raw data into usable data sets that they can buy and sell. Again, just from an economic point of view and a business model point of view, that's great. You can collect all this data, but how are you going to sell it? And how are you going to educate a new crop of users that this is really valuable information? And to your point, you shouldn't have to go to school to get a degree in GIS to be able to use the data, right? So we'll see. But so maybe one final question for you is, IDC is now covering this market quite extensively. I certainly don't see some of your competitors doing it quite as well, but do you think that IDC was forced into covering this area for obvious reasons, that there's more of it?
Well, I mean, I would say that, we try to go to where our clients are, maybe a step or two ahead of them. I'm not a hockey player, right? But skate to where the puck's going, not to where the puck is.
Right.
Just, having worked in the general data as a service space, what we found was over the past several years, over half of the companies that were looking for data that had a location component. Or something related to that, if you're just looking for information about businesses or people to market to, or, even some other kinds of metrics and sales related things, people kind of know where to go, and the change there is incremental. Whereas the change in this location and geospatial space it's changing rapidly, and I think it's poised for, just like a huge difference.
Great. I'm glad to hear you say that. That's job security for maybe both of us, I guess. So
I think so.
Yeah, good. Well, we'll leave it there. Again, thank you, Lynn, for doing this. It's been a great conversation. Appreciate your time.
Always nice catching up with you, Joe.
Thanks again for joining us on another On Point with Karim. And if you like today's podcast, please leave a comment in the comment box where this podcast is posted, which could be Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. I hope you'll join us next time for another On Point with Karim, where we'll get on point.